Hi, and welcome to the next edition of Hello CISO on employee surveillance versus enterprise security. I'm going to be talking about both those topics in this episode, and I'm going to begin with the employee surveillance side of things, and in particular the flip side of that coin, employee privacy. Because whilst there are benefits in surveillance, privacy is more important today than ever. I want to focus on advocating employee privacy by default, why that's a smart play in terms of security, and why collecting more data on your employees isn't always a good thing. I want to begin by defining surveillance software, and it is a very broad term, especially when you consider all the things that could be observed about your employees in terms of their digital habits. Not just their digital habits, but sometimes their movements as well. So for example, keystroke logging. What are people typing into the keyboard? GPS logging. Where are they? Perhaps that's GPS logging based on a mobile device. Perhaps it's GPS logging based on, say, a corporate vehicle. Time tracking. We have done this for centuries, clocking in and clocking out. On a more modern note, browsing history. Where are people visiting in their browsers whilst they're on the corporate network? And of course, people aren't just using the internet for browsing, they're also using it for things like social media, instant messaging. What are employees doing on those platforms? Then we get into a realm of employee surveillance that we've had for many decades now, and that's surveillance via video. So how are people moving around the office? When are they physically sitting at their desk? And of course, these days we have video over IP as well. We're doing things like Zoom sessions. There are surveillance technologies that can look at what people are broadcasting during one of those remote meetings. And for that matter, surveillance software can also be looking at people's desktops. So we're talking about moving images, either of people or of the work they're doing on the screen. But it all begs the question, why are companies surveilling their employees? What is the upside to this? Well, one obvious reason, particularly when it goes back to the days of clocking in and clocking out, is this is relevant to payroll. When are people at the office working? When are they no longer there? Some industries have legal requirements to surveil the activities of employees, particularly heavily regulated industries like the finance industry. So very often there is a compliance requirement for organisations to have some degree of surveillance over their employees. Then there is the whole realm of productivity tracking. Are your employees actually being good corporate citizens? Are they being productive? And surveillance has many different ways of monitoring that. So for example, keystrokes. How many keystrokes are people making per day? Is it 1,000? Maybe not doing so much work. Is it 10,000? Perhaps a more productive employee. What about other activities people perform whilst sitting at their PCs? The number of documents opened. If there's a usual pattern there, and then suddenly that pattern dips, could it possibly indicate a loss of productivity on behalf of the employee? Now, this doesn't even mean that you always have to actually implement surveillance. Just the thought of potentially being surveilled can cause people to change their behaviour. They might be less likely to slack off. This is known as the Hawthorne effect, where people modify aspects of their behaviour just because they're worried about being observed. Let's now transition and talk about the impact of all this increased surveillance on security. And people who advocate for surveillance and who can draw a direct line between surveillance and productivity are always going to have the ear of management. Often, the voice advocating for increased surveillance in the name of productivity is not advocating for privacy. When that voice speaks up and says, hey, we can increase the organisation's productivity by 6% by using surveillance, often that seems like a no-brainer. Now, whether it's surveillance or technologies that we implement for security, the premise of collecting more data, being able to do more analysis, is a common thread. It adds value to both surveillance and security. But it also creates risks. This is the flip side of additional surveillance. It creates risks to privacy and ultimately risks to the organisation. One of the biggest risks we have when we talk about data collection, the likes that are done through surveillance, is that we do actually have an increased threat. Because now we have a whole bunch of very often quite sensitive information being collected by the surveillance software. Now, often this software has to run on machines under elevated privileges. That alone is a risk. But then think about all the information it captures. What if it's capturing keystrokes? What if those keystrokes include passwords? And now they're stored somewhere in plain text. That is now a risk. What happens if someone gains access to that information? Now, many of these products may take a whole number of different steps to ensure that the data is encrypted, say, in transport. What happens at the other end? If the data needs to be legible at some point in time, it has to be retrievable in plain text. So that the risk we have is we take things like passwords, which might exist in secure locations such as password managers, and then end up sitting there in plain text somewhere centrally within the realm of the surveillance software. I personally have seen data breaches of numerous surveillance products, particularly those that fit into the spyware category. There are multiple data breaches in Have I Been Pwned of organisations that ran surveillance software on individuals' machines and then lost it. In many of these cases, very sensitive personal information, messages, photos, other PII end up floating around the internet because surveillance software hasn't done a good enough job of protecting it. Now let's get to the hidden costs of surveillance software, because collecting all of this information by surveilling employees is one thing, but storing it and making it accessible later on is another. That comes with a cost, and that cost may well offset some or a significant part of the gains achieved by surveillance software in the first place. Then there are privacy impact assessments. Very often this may be done at the beginning of a surveillance program, but what about on an ongoing basis? The landscape within an organisation does change, so privacy impact assessments are something which should be performed on an ongoing basis, but they come with a cost as well. So what we're seeing here is that it's not all just gains. There is another column here offsetting it in terms of expenses. Now let's delve deeper, and then we get into the whole realm of what controls do we put around stored data. So for example, who can access it? There might be a lot of very sensitive personal information in there. It could be things that people type into the browser. It could also be video of their movements. There has to be access controls around that, and that has to be maintained, and the people who have access also need to be trained. Then what about data retention? How long will that information be kept for? Is it only required for a very short period of time in case we need to review a recent incident? Or does it sit there for perpetuity? And years from now, the organisation still wears the risk of the data that it's collected today. Then we throw in privacy laws as well, and this is where things start to get really complicated, particularly for multinational organisations spanning different jurisdictions. Privacy laws keep evolving. So how does your surveillance program adapt to be in compliance with the laws? Not just today where you are, but in the future and potentially in other places the organisation operates. And then the greatest threat of all to this data is the same threat that we worry about so much of our other data with. Bad actors who want to gain access to that data and exploit it for their own gain. We've got to worry about those folks with surveillance data just as we have to worry about them with customer data as well. If I'm a security officer, I know that I have great intentions with how the data is handled. And my priority is going to be to minimize data. I want to collect less of it rather than more of it, because the less data I have, the less data I can lose. Let's talk about advocating for privacy by default. And we'll go back to that business case saying that there could be a 6% boost in productivity through increased surveillance. Without a privacy advocate, no one is arguing about the flip side of that. But someone who can make the case for those hidden costs and privacy risks suddenly forces the 6% gain to justify itself. It brings more balance into the discussion. Now, let's assume that there is justification for increased surveillance and you do want to forge ahead with the program. What happens next? The first step is to appoint someone as a privacy advocate. This doesn't need to be a formal role like a privacy officer, and indeed each project could have its own privacy advocate. The second step is transparency. Some companies have found employees are much happier with the idea of surveillance and indeed sharing their data if they know what it's being used for. And look, let's face it, we all enjoy a good productivity boost, and many of us already monitor aspects of our own daily lives in order to make them more fulfilling, more productive, more energetic. Good example here on my wrist. So we're used to quantifying a whole bunch of different aspects about what we do already. Thirdly, rather than collecting as much data as possible and figuring out what to do with it all later, try defining some project goals that are as specific as possible at the outset. Then only collect the data that contributes to that specific goal. This is just simple data minimization. How do we make sure that we have what we need to perform the task we're setting out to do in the first place, but not excessive amounts which create additional risk? Finally, open a dialogue. Create a channel or nominate a specific person who employees can come to with any concerns they might have about surveillance. To wrap up and summarize, employee tracking or surveillance software does come with risks, but there are also risks which can be mitigated and managed responsibly. Responsible deployment involves weighing the benefits of monitoring against the security risks, privacy concerns, and the costs and obligations of data storage. And finally, and above all else, operating a responsible monitoring program means being transparent, not just about what data is being collected, but what it's being used for. If you've enjoyed this video as part of the Hello CISO series, then please give it a like and subscribe to the 1Password YouTube channel for more videos like this.